Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
It's a sad day here at Utter Bollocks because it's the last episode in the series, although we will be back in October. But
we will.
To lighten things up, we've got two fascinating topics to be discussed over with myself, Otto English, and
me, John Mitchinson.
And hello from me, AI Joe, the real star of this show. Using the voice of Joanna Scanlon because Scarlett Johansson wasn't available and sent a lawyer's letter. The last episode in the current series looks at the two burning questions of our era. Was Boris Johnson the worst ever Prime Minister? And do ghosts exist?
all packed into a neat little 35 to 40 minute package. This should be interesting.
Let's hope.
John's final question for Otto this season is one that has vexed many a British brain for the last 5 years, ever since he took office in number 10 in 2019. Was Alexander de Pfeffel Johnson, commonly known as Boris, the worst Prime Minister in the history of Great Britain?
It's a big one.
It is
Otto,
a big one. It is a big one. I think we need...
if there's any man who can answer it, I have my faith in you.
I think we need to break this down into bite-sized pieces. So we can look at the 56 prime ministers who have been the first minister of this country, or we can look at those in the post-war era, or we can look at the ones in the 21st century. So let's do that. Let's start with the 21st century.
Go on. It's not been going on all that long. Come on.
It's been the longest 4 years of my life. I don't know about you. In the last 14 years,
how many
seems to have been decades.
Remind our keen-eared listeners how many premiers we've had, prime ministers we've had in that period.
We've had 9.
Amazing.
So the decade began with Tony Blair. Mm-hmm. Then we had Gordon Brown. Then we had David Cameron. Then we had, he tries to forget, Theresa May. Then we had Boris Pfeffel Johnson. Then we had Liz, blink and you miss her, Truss. And now we've
More
got...
of a punctuation mark than a...
not even, yes.
Minister.
And then finally, Rishi the Dishy Sunak with his lovely hair. And we'll talk about him in a moment. So let's start with this century. Now, it's always difficult and dangerous to rank people, so let's do it. I'm going to be a little bit left field here and say one might expect me to say that Tony Blair was the best Prime Minister of the 21st century. I don't think he was.
Interesting.
I think Gordon Brown was the best Prime Minister of the 21st century.
A controversial view. A
controversial view. Although he was blamed for wrecking the world economy by the Tories and their lackeys in the press, there's a very good case that he saved large chunks of it from even greater disaster and then received the blame, as all firefighters, well, not all firefighters, normally firefighters are praised. But he did a good thing. Blair, by getting involved in the Iraq War, in my opinion, completely blots his copybook. But I think Blair did good things. So I would rank Brown first. I would rank Blair second.
Interesting.
Then things get more tricky because the rest of them is just like a sort of turds race, really, isn't it?
And none of them floaters.
All of them floaters. Yeah. Which one can you flush the fastest?
Yeah.
Well, on that basis, I would put May as next. Because
a well-meaning, not incompetent person.
I don't think she was particularly well-meaning. Right. But in a field of shits, she's probably the least...
She smells a little sweeter.
Yes. It's easy now to think that Theresa May somehow was a good Prime Minister or a well-intentioned person, but then you've got to forget her appalling record as Home Secretary and those vans that went around saying, we're going to throw you out of the country. She was part of that sort of descent into hell.
But it's a race to the bottom.
A race to the bottom. So I would put her next. I would put Sunak after that, because although...
Well-meaning. Is he?
I
wish the listeners could see your face. The exhaustion, the exhaustion and pain that's furrowing your brow.
I think Sunak would be next. Then you've got a problem. So here's...
Thunderbird 0.5, as the great Ross Jones calls him.
Here's the big challenge. Of the three Remainers, you've got Truss, Johnson and Cameron. Who is the worst? Well, to be honest, although I personally dislike the man, I'm not going to say that Johnson was the worst Prime Minister. I think it was Cameron.
Oof.
And I think
this not the sound of your fox being kind of properly shot before we've even got to?
I'm talking of this century.
Okay.
We will then look in over the course of the last 100 years. But in terms of the immediate damage that David Cameron has caused to this country, there's no one close. Because by calling that referendum and gambling the entire nation on trying to fix up a backbench rebellion, Cameron fucked this country. And the man's comeback into the political sphere is a shocker. I don't think he should be allowed near a Play-Doh kitchen, let alone the Foreign Office. So in those terms, he's the worst. However, it's a bit like in The Apprentice when he's deciding, he's going to like, you were however, and then he puts someone completely different else. However, in the bigger scheme of things, Boris Johnson, for his enormous, unfettered ambition and complete lack of competence, charm, human decency, intelligence, imagination, and everything else that goes with it, I think I'm going to place him equal bottom with David Cameron.
You've got it. That's technicality, but we
got it on a technicality.
I have met both of these men, and in fact,
met or befriended.
Oh, definitely not befriended.
Right.
David Cameron was my MP.
Right.
With the Witney constituency, which he'd inherited from the, I have to say, rather excellent Douglas Hurd. If a favourite Tory isn't an oxymoron, then he was definitely one of my favourites. That kind of one world, one nation, sort of the more liberal end of the Tory party, which I thought he represented. He was a diplomat, a smart politician. Cameron was, as I say, he was MP, so I'd met him for lunch twice in various contexts. In fact, the context that I live in a village, somewhat feudal village in Oxfordshire, as I'm sure some people will know. And the chatelaine, the wife of James Johnston, who owned the village, his wife Anastasia, rang us, my wife and I, and said, John, I know you're pinkos, but we have the new MP coming round. And basically she's saying we need people who can kind of, fill out a table and not sound like idiots or fascists, of which I'm sure there are plenty out there in Oxfordshire. But so we were invited, and he was he's an extremely charming...
but here's the thing, John. I too have met David Cameron.
Well, there you go.
Right. But the difference is I met him at a drinks party, and it must be... When did you meet him? It would have been around the same time. He was like a relatively new MP.
I mean, he was untested at this point.
But at the time I met him, he was writing a weekly column for The Guardian.
Wow.
And he wrote a column for The Guardian, and I met him at a drinks party, at a book launch. And as soon as he worked out that I had literally nothing to offer him, neither my vote or anything else, he completely blanked me and walked off. Now, so it's not a personal dislike, because, of course, I am and always have been a very unimportant person. But I had nothing to bring to his table. And he made a swift exit from the party shortly after that, murmuring to the person who was with, "Oh, there's nothing here going on."
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot about David Cameron. He was a man on the make.
Absolutely ambitious and all the things that people say, really. I mean, not unpleasant, but also glib.
Yeah,
And
a PR man.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that Etonian confidence, that trick that you learn to make it sound like you believe in everything that you're saying and that you actually got the answer when you clearly don't have the answer and you're not confident of what you're saying. It's that bullshit that ended up with the Brexit referendum.
Absolutely.
I mean,
arrogance, we call that.
You could argue that he was taking up the Blairite, middle-of-the-road agenda, but the thing that was always going to screw the Tory party, and still does, is an inability to really work out what's the constituency that they're looking at. Are they really going to throw their lot in with the people who want to pull Britain out of its largest economic trading partner? And it was from Thatcher onwards, it has torn, probably before that. I mean, right back to the debates over the common market. It has been the issue that has held the Tories under the waterline, and by extension now all of us, because we're all now having to deal with the horrendous and very well advertised consequences of leaving Europe without a plan. To which brings us seamlessly to your case against B. Johnson.
Funnily enough, I also met Margaret Thatcher in my 20s at a drinks party at the House of Commons in a very peculiar fashion, and she was disconcertingly flirty.
Disconcerting, yeah.
Very disconcertingly flirty. It was a very peculiar experience. It was like being in a strange fever dream. I drunk rather too much champagne, and it was me and Margaret Thatcher having a sort of fairly lengthy conversation about Southeast Asia. It was really, really peculiar. And I kept standing there thinking, is this real? Am I really standing here talking to Margaret Thatcher? And Dennis made a sort of guest appearance in the conversation. And then I said something which pissed her off so much that she just turned around and walked off.
Yeah.
And somebody came up to me and went, she doesn't like to be contradicted.
Yeah, well, I discovered this the hard way too. I had to introduce her at a literary dinner up in Manchester. It was when she was doing the Downing Street years, where they said if you can find an unsigned copy, it'd be quite valuable.
Also Lord Geoffrey Archer.
Yeah, I've never seen anyone sign quite so rapidly as Thatcher. But it was really difficult. I had to cross a rather ridiculous picket line to get to the dinner with people talk, sort of Tory scum. It's difficult if you're in a dinner jacket and you're going to something to
try to explain to each individual.
To get the nuance across.
Yeah. I'm not Tory scum. I'm just hanging out with them.
Anyway, the interesting thing was she was there and she was I felt she was half asleep, famously. She only sleeps 4 hours a night. And she had a full tumbler of whiskey, amazingly coiffed and a very elegant dress. But I was getting nothing out of her people. And then she got up and she gave this really pretty remarkable speech. Remarkable to me because it was the sort of creation myth of the Labour Party was the story she was taking. Sort of chapel radicalism and growing up poor and educating herself in the public libraries. And you could see the audience lapping it up. But for the first time, I absolutely understood the genius of what she'd been able to do was she was able to make Toryism accessible to working class people in a way that it had never been before. She played that brilliantly. And at the same time, I remember thinking, yeah, but that's going to kind of clash with her globalist, that Little England thing is going to clash with the global economic theories that she's, from Hayek and Friedman, that she was also. You could see that there was a sort of
dangerous mix.
An incompatibility there.
A paradox.
But like you, I also, by the time she got a standing ovation and I sat down and I thought I can't allow all my family who've, miners and worked on the shipyards to not be represented. So I said, fascinating to hear your stories about libraries, Mrs. Thatcher. I'm just astonished that under your government, at this stage it was only a third of public libraries have closed. We have never closed a single library. I said, well, they have closed. How local authorities choose to spend their money is their business. And I said, but you give them you set the tax regimes under which they're able, and they're not going to cut frontline services. And anyway, it went on like this. She didn't give an inch.
No.
And what was interesting, I suddenly
Even though she was wrong.
Even though she was wrong. That, to me, was an insight into exactly
so I had, my thing was, we stumbled onto the topic of Southeast Asia, I think because at the time East Timor was trying to get independence from Indonesia. Anyway, we got to the topic of Indonesia, and I've lived in Indonesia, and it swiftly became apparent that I knew a lot more about Indonesia than Margaret Thatcher did. And she said to me, but of course the trouble with Indonesia was it was never ruled by the British. And I said to her, well, that's not true. And she said, what do you mean it wasn't true? And I said, well, Raffles famously, after the
Gentleman
Napoleonic,
Thief.
the Gentleman Thief, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain ran what became Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, for about 11 years, I think it was, before he realised there was no point in wasting your time on Indonesia. You just set up a colony in Singapore and could govern the whole area with gunships. And that's when she turned around and walked off.
Yeah. Well,
But as she walked away, I thought, do you know what? One day I'll tell this story in a podcast with John Mitchinson.
I've got to haul you back to the actual
yes.
question, because I think we can all agree that Thatcher, though she's responsible for much about this country that I really regret and loathe. And, she was a pretty competent leader, but a pretty good communicator. I mean, one of the things for
It
me
will
is,
make us unpopular, but I think you're right.
if
yes.
you've ever seen Boris Johnson, as it were, speak publicly, you realise that it is kind of an embarrassing
he's
parody of a
this is what I
political...
don't, and we'll come back to him in a moment. Let's quickly talk about some other candidates. Anthony Eden, pill-popping, incompetent old Etonian. He's got to be in the running.
looker.
Good looker, nice hair.
Homburg.
Good sharp suits. But I think Eden probably, but again, that school, you see, Eton, it's churned out. And, Alec Douglas-Hume, you could probably add him, but he was one of the unfortunates that inherited a mess. Neville Chamberlain, you could probably chuck in. Balfour, you could probably chuck in. But in the grand scheme of things, of somebody being handed the world on a plate after having made a huge bit about how they... Oh, in fact, that's a noble mention for Winston Churchill's second administration, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, absolute disaster,
Shambles.
and the man didn't know what the hell he was doing. Those people aside... I think it's Cameron and Johnson, and I think the lesson that... And I would say that for the last 124 years, they are the standout worst prime ministers this country has ever had, with Liz Truss as a sort of little puppet on the side. And that's my opinion.
Unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our segment. You have made a case, which we might have more to say about this in even more bollocks later, but I haven't got time to go into the times I met Boris Johnson, but those of you who are listening to this podcast and have not yet subscribed, what a good moment to do so.
Yes. I thought you were saying you're not yet born. Boris Johnson's
sadly.
children, yes.
No, but I will explain to you why watching the rise of Boris Johnson has been a waking nightmare for me. I mean, like the very most slow-motion car crash, and assuming that every time he came up to a kind of a new milestone in his remarkable, you have to say it is remarkable for all the wrong reasons, career, that somehow he got away with it. Well, he's not getting away with it now, and let's hope never again. But we've got to really say whether we think, I'm going to have to turn to AI Joe to see whether we think you've actually scored this one as the deep truth or utter bollocks.
So this should be easy for my AI brain to decode. Was Boris Johnson the worst Prime Minister ever? Searching. Calculator.
It's doing the wheel spinny thing.
Yeah. The wheel of
Spinny
doom. The spinning wheel of doom.
Yes.
I'm still learning how to answer this question. In the meantime, try Google search.
Very good.
Okay, it's
Come on, we got to put up.
We've broken the AI.
I thought we've previously done Worst MP, where I dug up Tribute Lincoln, who was a kind of just ludicrous kind of, but very, very minor. The thing is with prime ministers, it is quite hard. I mean, you think of the great Salisbury and Disraeli, whatever you're back to the the Whigs and the Tories of the early 19th century, Castlereagh.
I've got a soft spot for Disraeli, not least because he could write a really blistering line.
Yep.
And his blistering lines fill the dictionary of quotations in my own books when I pinch them. But
Lloyd George, Balfour, Baldwin.
What's Boris Johnson ever... You see, I know you shouldn't mark a great person by the epithets they leave. However, what has Boris Johnson ever actually said or done that is worthy? Well, what in 100 years? We quote Churchill rightly, in my opinion, because although
we've talked about Churchill on
Yeah.
a previous episode. I mean, whatever else you say about Churchill, there were genuine achievements there.
And the man could write a good line. He had the vision to get us through the Second World War. He had other visions as well, but not necessarily things I would necessarily agree with. Johnson was a man who stumbled from one position to the other just with the aim of getting the crown and sitting on the throne. And there's nothing to him.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Bullingdon kind of premierships, of which there are two, you kind of throw Osborne in as a sort of a minor character in that. But Osborne and Cameron, if they're remembered for anything, will be remembered for Brexit and austerity. Johnson will be remembered for COVID, probably, and all the ridiculous cover-ups. I mean, these are people who inherited power and had no idea what to do with it once they'd got it.
Nail on the head.
Their premierships will not be judged well by history. Is Boris Johnson the worst Prime Minister of all time? Is that utter bollocks? Is it tosh? Or is it the unvarnished truth? I think you've made a case for saying it's Cameron and Johnson together. And from the perspective I sit from here, you've said nothing to make me think that there are worse people in the last 124 years. So I think it's the opposite of utter bollocks. It's the unvarnished truth.
And I agree.
Utter Bullingdon. Otto's question for John this week, and his final one of the season, is a simple one. Do ghosts exist? Are they piffle, tosh, balderdash, utter supersized bollocks? Or can we find a trace of amazeballs in these phantom phenomena?
So, John, do ghosts exist?
Again, this is going to be one of those questions which there are two ways of approaching it. Let's go down the sort of route one, which is there any evidence that when someone dies, their spirit persists after death? Most of the materialist kind of medical literature will tell you that this is impossible. People die and their bodies are clearly no longer inhabited by whatever the animating spirit was there before. I was holding my father when he died, and I felt the absolute difference in that moment between him being alive, grumbling about my poor lifting technique, and him being completely dead, gone. Which was pretty mysterious, I have to say. But what I felt mostly, and I think a lot of people who've experienced dealing with the dead, is the absence of life. I mean, I think there's a very simple answer, which is they can't really exist in the way that if what we mean is that the consciousness of the person somehow exists after death, there doesn't seem to be much kind of evidence that we can rally to put that forward. However,
Somebody once
However,
said, somebody
there's a
said
big
to me,
however.
I'm going to let you have your however, but you've just, when my own father died, somebody said to me, the two greatest privileges you can have in the life are to be there when somebody's born and when they die. I've always taken that with me, and having been present at my children's birth and at the death of my father, sadly just missing out on the death of my mother, that's something I've always taken with me. But are we reading ourselves into that? I don't know.
One of the things I did was to try and understand what my father was quite ill on multiple levels. But I was fascinated to know what had actually killed him, what happened in that moment that meant that he suddenly was no longer conscious. I mean, we often associate life with consciousness, although, of course, people can be alive and unconscious. I mean, there are people who are unconscious for years before they officially die. So the whole issue of what life is and what consciousness is, we're not going to solve that in the next 20 minutes, by the way.
We can try.
We give a crack. Well, I think, it was for my dad, he was getting old. In the end, his heart, which had been dodgy since he was 48 years old, he'd had 3 triple bypasses. He was at that point before he died, his prostate cancer was also in a kind of critical phase, and we were taking him off medication, but it was his heart finally that was literally not pumping enough blood to his brain. The whole thing shuts down and bang, and they're gone. So that was helpful and useful for me to understand what had happened, but it never really quite solves the problem, the mystery of what a person is, and how are they there one moment and not there the next moment. I don't believe that ghosts are wish fulfillment, and this is the point I want to make. Ghosts exist, if they exist at all, because we need them to exist. And it may also be that there is more, in heaven and earth that's dreamt of in our materialistic philosophy. We're beginning to understand that time isn't really linear in the way that we think about it. The wonders of the quantum universe are so complex. What is absolutely true is there is not a culture on the planet that doesn't have some version of the ghost.
Yeah, ancestry worship or ancestors being present.
Some
with
kind
us.
of meaningful connection. There are too many. We've all had experiences. We've all had stories. We love these stories. They're absolutely fundamental to our culture and to, as I say, to pretty much every other culture on the planet. There will be some idea that death is not the end, that something lives on in some kind of dimension that we don't fully understand. So I'm not going the full amazeballs on this. I'm always nervous when people just say there can be no such thing as a ghost. Well, there are things as ghosts, but are they, whether they exist as projections of people's minds, or they are some objective reality, that I think is where it's difficult. I was obsessed when I was younger with Harry Price, the great psychic investigator, so-called, who wrote The Most Haunted House in England about Borley Rectory. And then did The End of Borley Rectory, because, the stories were amazing, and the thought that there was a nun whose life had been ended through murder, and all the automatic writing on the walls, and we all know the poltergeist stories, and they often seem to manifest with teenage girls in particular going through puberty. Something definitely goes on. But what I felt about Price was that he was trying with all his ridiculous equipment. It was almost like he was using the wrong equipment to find out what was going on, that the ghosts...
That was the technological answer.
Somehow you're going to be able... And that's what all those ghost shows on television, that's why they're always
They're brilliant. For all the wrong reasons.
They're brilliant for all the wrong reasons. But push me and say, do you think, if we were asking the question the other way, do ghosts definitely not exist? I think it's a bit like saying, does God idea of God, an idea of ghosts, these things, the numinous, the impossible to capture with our materialistic tools, that's pretty important.
As you're speaking, it occurs to me that the end of the four Gospels are all ghosts. Well, not all of them, but they're ghost stories, aren't they? Because Jesus reappears.
Unless you believe he did corporeally.
Well, but in a sense, and also...
You're not putting your finger in his side then, Otto?
I'm afraid not. I haven't got a spirit hand or a finger. Ghosts sometimes appear at kind of moments of huge tension. And Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, which is the second best book about World War I after Richard Aldington's Death of a Hero, but that's a story for another day. His book is littered with ghost stories. I don't know if you've read that recently. I've read it several times because it is such an extraordinary book. He sort of sees people at windows who he knows are dead. He encounters people in trenches who he knew died a year ago. He's driving down a road one day and he sees a soldier salute him at the side who he knows has been killed. And these sort of ghost stories of World War I, which almost certainly sort of fed into the post-war spiritualist movement as people tried to contact dead, lost children and loved ones, comes out of immense trauma. And I put out a tweet. By the time anyone hears this, it will be weeks ago. But I put out a tweet yesterday asking people if they could share ghost stories in preparation for this so we could plagiarise all of their material. It struck me that a lot of the stories that people said were something traumatic had happened, like a grandparent had died or somebody, and they felt a presence, or they felt the person at the door, sometimes just before or sometimes just after. And after my father died, I woke up one morning and I could clearly hear his voice speaking in my room. It was the most unnerving thing. This is 30 years ago. I, as you know, am the world's most sceptical person about such things. But there was a sense, maybe it was me, maybe it was somewhere sitting in that dreamlike world of a longing, a subconscious longing within me for some evidence of afterlife. So what we as humans do to offset the fear of the eternity, of the emptiness of human existence after we pass, is perhaps manifested in ghosts.
I don't think I know of anyone who hasn't had some kind of version of that experience that you had. We dream every night, and people are sometimes more real in the dreams than, dare I say it, we meet in everyday life. So I think it's one of those questions which is ultimately, like I say, if we want to try and prove ghosts exist in this dimension, what I would call the Radio 4. If you think of consciousness as being a bandwidth, most of us are tuned into Radio 4 most of the time, and yet the whole of the bandwidth, ultraviolet, infrared is much bigger than that. And we don't even really know how to talk about these things. So much of our lives are constricted in a way because that's where we need to live to earn our living and get on. But we all find ways to occupy the whole of the spectrum, whether it's through dreams or taking crazy drugs or deep grief. I do think there's evidence that trauma can change the way the brain perceives things. And we all know that now that perception isn't what we think it is. We've talked about this on previous episodes. It's not about stuff coming in and us interpreting it. It's about our brains pulsing out predictions. And when those predictions, I mean, most people who've lost somebody will have that moment where they think they see them on the street and then they have to shake to realise it's not them. So you're going to have to ask
AI Joe.
Well away from the spurious speculations of our superstitious duo, General Artificial Intelligence has a no-nonsense approach to this question about ghosts. Processing. Large language models activated. Replicating splines. And the answer is... The belief in ghosts has been around for centuries, and there are many stories and legends about them. However, there is no scientific evidence to support the existence of ghosts. Science relies on evidence that can be observed and measured, and there is no way to measure or detect ghosts. Scientists have looked for evidence of ghosts for many years, but have not found anything conclusive. There are a number of explanations for why people might believe in ghosts. Some people may have had experiences that they cannot explain, or they may have been influenced by stories and movies about ghosts. Others may find comfort in the belief that there is life after death.
So speaks the voice in the ghost in the machine.
Yeah, very good. I think it's pretty spot on, really, as well. Can't fault that. It's a bit like the discussion, does Spider-Man exist? Yes. Spider-Man exists.
I agree.
We can all imagine Spider-Man in our heads. We can even say what his characteristics are like. He's a work of human fiction, but he looms in our collective imagination. And that's the same, to some extent, with the notion of ghosts.
Yeah, it's a bit like, does Elizabeth Bennet exist?
Yes, or Gordon.
Yeah. For a lot of people, invented characters are as real as...
Yes, exactly that.
Or more real somewhere.
Yeah.
AI's given us exactly the answer we expected and hoped, and not scientifically provable. Well, we knew that, but...
We knew it when we started.
Why is so much of the universe invisible? All the important things. Love, hope, all the things that we really, really matter and that change people's lives and that they're prepared sometimes even to kill for. Why? Mostly all invisible. I mean, you know, the material,
a lot of the
material
stuff that
world
matters too, as well. I mean, that's something...
Ironically, given what matter is, yes.
That is a pet theme of mine. We don't talk up the human species enough, and the good stuff.
Yeah.
Love being one of them.
Well, I'm going to say it's your call.
I don't think it's bollocks. I think it's sort of amaze-ish balls.
Amaze-ish balls.
Amaze-ish balls.
In a parallel universe.
In a parallel universe, yeah. Which is not to say that I believe in ghosts, but I do believe in Spider-Man.
You believe in people.
I believe in people. It's turning into a Stevie Wonder song.
And the conclusion is twaddle.
In even more bollocks, which is coming up after this episode, we will take a spooky half hour and share some ghost stories, including, I think, Peter Jukes' rather peculiar experience.
And you've got a ghost story.
I have a ghost story of my own.
What are you going to share some of the stuff that you've got?
And we will share some extraordinary stories that people were kind enough to share with me overnight, yeah.
And now we come to our audience-friendly Any Answers section, with questions submitted by our devoted listeners and followers. A question from audience member Adriana. Can crystals heal people?
No.
Well, that was quick. I think we're in the territory now of what people might believe. I can see that there might be some exciting kind of placebo. I mean, it's like all these things. Anything can heal you if you believe in it enough. We know this from placebo. a crystal, if you vest it with enough kind of significance, might have a positive effect. Science would suggest that it would be quite difficult for an inert piece of the ground to really have any obvious physical effect. But the mental effects of healing, the more we learn about placebo, the more we realise that that's often what does heal people. I mean, we believe in chemicals. It's no more superstitious. So just no, I think it was AI Joe who said in a recent episode that science is about measuring and testing and repetition. Crystals don't really pass that test.
So in
sorry
short...
to be disappointing.
No.
AI Joe is putting out a request for questions to submit for the next series. Any questions are welcome. All questions are welcome. The best way of doing this is signing up for full member benefits on bylineaudio.com, where you will not only get access to extra premium content, such as Even More Bollocks with Peter Jukes, and all our podcasts ad-free, and with bonus material, but be able to join the Wikibollocks forum and contribute to our compendium of Codswallop.
Anyway, it's been great fun spending all this time with you, John.
It's been a blast.
It's been fun, yeah.
And far too quick, like as so often with these things.
Flash in the pan.
I know, suddenly it's 12 down and we've got to go and obviously spend all our ill-gotten gains enlarging it up over the summer.
Exactly.
But we'll be back, October?
I'm looking forward to it, yes. All good things must pass.
But obviously, good questions, they are very, very
They're
welcome.
eternal.
They are eternal.
This has been a Byline audio production in association with Unbound, produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and for Even More Bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.